They called it the safe alternative. Turns out it was just a quieter kind of dangerous. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most prescribed drug you've probably never worried about, and that's exactly the problem. Somewhere in America right now, a man is crushing a small white pill on the back of a toilet tank in a gas station bathroom. He's not a heroin addict. He doesn't live under a bridge. He has a job, a truck, and a prescription bottle with his name on it. The pill he's snorting isn't OxyContin. It isn't fentanyl. It's Gabapentin, a drug that millions of people take every single day, that doctors hand out like breath mints, and that the medical establishment spent 30 years insisting was completely, categorically, scientifically non-addictive. They were wrong. Spectacularly, lethally wrong. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The story of Gabapentin doesn't begin in a trap house or an alley. It begins in a laboratory in the late 1970s with a group of chemists trying to do something genuinely good. Epilepsy at that time was a condition that destroyed lives. Existing anticonvulsant drugs worked, but they came with brutal side effects, liver damage, cognitive fog, dangerous interactions with almost everything else. Scientists wanted something cleaner, something that could calm the brain's electrical storms without burning the house down in the process. The molecule they built was elegant by pharmaceutical standards. It was designed to mimic gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, the chemical that essentially tells overexcited neurons to sit down and be quiet. GABA itself couldn't be used as a drug because it couldn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So the researchers built a structural analogue, a chemical cousin, that could cross that barrier, get inside the brain, and do the job. They named it Gabapentin. It was synthesized by a scientist named Sill and developed under the pharmaceutical company Parke-Davis, which was later absorbed by Warner Lambert, which was later swallowed whole by Pfizer. The drug cleared clinical trials and received FDA approval in 1993 for the treatment of partial seizures in adults. At that point, it was a legitimate medical tool for a specific population. Nothing about that moment suggested what was coming. Nothing about a modestly effective anticonvulsant suggested that 30 years later it would be snorted in prison cells, traded on street corners, and implicated in tens of thousands of deaths. What happened next is a story about marketing as much as medicine. Parke-Davis didn't want Gabapentin to be just an epilepsy drug. The profit margins on anticonvulsants were decent, but the patient population was limited. The real money was in broader applications, conditions that affected not hundreds of thousands of people, but tens of millions. So the company began aggressively promoting Gabapentin for uses the FDA had never approved: bipolar disorder, migraines, attention deficit disorder, restless leg syndrome, hot flashes in menopausal women, and, most significantly, chronic pain. This was off-label promotion. In the United States, it is perfectly legal for a doctor to prescribe a drug for a purpose it wasn't approved for. It is not legal for a pharmaceutical company to market it for those unapproved purposes. Parke-Davis did it anyway, systematically, deliberately, and on an enormous scale. Sales representatives were trained to push Gabapentin for pain management. Medical education conferences were funded to spread the message. Ghostwritten studies were published in legitimate journals under the names of respected physicians who had done little more than agree to lend their names to conclusions someone else had written. The strategy worked beyond any reasonable projection. By the late 1990s, Gabapentin was one of the fastest-growing drugs in America. Prescriptions were climbing not because new epilepsy patients were being diagnosed, but because physicians across every specialty, orthopedists, psychiatrists, internists, emergency room doctors, had been convinced that gabapentin was a safe, versatile solution to the chronic pain epidemic that was already beginning to define American healthcare. The year 2004 brought a reckoning, or what looked like one. Warner Lambert, by then part of Pfizer, pleaded guilty to criminal charges related to illegal off-label marketing of gabapentin. The fine was $430 million. For context, that sounds enormous. For Pfizer, a company generating over $50 billion in annual revenue, it was a cost of doing business. The executives responsible faced no prison time. The prescribing patterns that had been built over a decade didn't reverse because a fine was paid. If anything, the momentum was too strong to stop. By the time the settlement was announced, a generation of physicians had already been trained to think of gabapentin as a first-line option for pain. The drug had entered the medical culture so deeply that the legal finding, essentially, that the entire foundation of its expanded use had been built on illegal promotion, barely registered in clinical practice. Prescriptions continued to rise. The drug's reputation as safe and non-addictive, which had been built deliberately and spread systematically, remained intact. The FDA approved gabapentin for postherpetic neuralgia, the burning nerve pain that follows shingles, in 2002, and this gave physicians a legitimate anchor for prescribing it broadly for nerve pain of any kind. A legal off-label prescription for diabetic neuropathy, for back pain, for fibromyalgia, required only a doctor willing to write it, and those doctors were everywhere, because they had been told, repeatedly, by people they trusted, that gabapentin was safe. The timing of gabapentin's rise cannot be separated from the catastrophe that was unfolding simultaneously. The OxyContin crisis had begun to break into public awareness by the early 2000s. By 2010, the CDC was calling prescription opioid overdoses an epidemic. States began restricting opioid prescribing. The DEA tightened monitoring. Doctors who had been freely prescribing opioids for chronic pain became afraid of lawsuits, of losing their licenses, of being the doctor whose patient died. They needed an alternative, something they could offer patients who came in with pain, something that couldn't kill them, something with no abuse potential, something clean. Gabapentin was waiting. It had no DEA schedule. It required no special prescription pad. Pharmacies didn't flag it. Insurance companies covered it readily because it was cheap. Generic gabapentin cost pennies per pill. A doctor looking for a safe harbour from the opioid crisis found one, and millions of them grabbed it. Between 2002 and 2015, the number of gabapentin prescriptions in the United States more than tripled. By 2022, over 45 million prescriptions were being written annually, making it consistently one of the top 10 most prescribed drugs in the country. It was prescribed for anxiety even though it wasn't approved for anxiety. It was prescribed for insomnia, for alcohol withdrawal, for migraine prevention, for post-operative pain. It became the medical system's all-purpose answer to suffering, a drug that could be given to almost anyone for almost anything, with the reassurance that it posed no real danger. Nobody asked what 45 million prescriptions meant in terms of pills sitting in medicine cabinets, purses, gym bags, and glove compartments across the country. Nobody asked what happened when those pills found their way to people who weren't the intended patients. Nobody asked what was actually happening inside the brains of the millions of people who had been taking gabapentin daily for years, because the science said it wasn't addictive, and the science, everyone believed, was settled. The science was not settled. It had never been properly tested. The clinical trials that established gabapentin as non-addictive had been short, weeks, not years. They had excluded the populations most likely to misuse it. They had been funded in many cases by the same companies that needed the drug to look safe. The assumption of safety was not a conclusion drawn from comprehensive evidence. It was a conclusion that had been convenient, profitable, and repeated so many times it had calcified into fact. In rural Kentucky, something was already going wrong. Pharmacists were noticing unusual quantities. Emergency room physicians were seeing overdose patients who tested negative for opioids. Coroners were finding gabapentin in bodies. The signal was there, buried in data that no one was required to collect, visible to people whose job it was to count the dead, but invisible to the system that had created the problem in the first place. The drug nobody suspected was already building its case. The human brain is not a democracy. It's a chemical dictatorship, and whoever controls the neurotransmitters controls everything. Mood, pain, memory, the feeling that life is worth living. Gabapentin understood this in a way its creators didn't fully anticipate, and that gap between what they intended and what the brain actually did with the drug is where the entire epidemic was born. To understand why people snort gabapentin, you have to understand what it does at the neurological level, not in the sanitized language of a package insert, but in the raw mechanical reality of what happens inside a human skull when the drug arrives. Gabapentin binds to a specific subunit of voltage-gated calcium channels, the alpha-2 delta subunit to be precise. These channels are the brain's signal amplifiers. When neurons are overexcited, firing too fast, too hard, transmitting pain signals that won't shut off, these calcium channels are part of the mechanism keeping that excitation going. Gabapentin clamps down on them. It turns the volume down. For someone in genuine chronic pain, that effect is close to miraculous. The relentless electrical screaming in damaged nerves goes quiet. For the first time in months, sometimes years, the pain becomes manageable. That is the legitimate version of the drug's effect. But the brain doesn't read prescriptions. What researchers and eventually users discovered is that gabapentin's effect on calcium channels doesn't stay neatly confined to pain pathways. The drug also influences dopamine release, indirectly, through a chain of neurological events that wasn't fully understood until long after the drug was already being prescribed to tens of millions of people. By dampening inhibitory neurons that would normally keep dopamine release in check, gabapentin can cause a surge of dopamine in the brain's reward circuits. Not the volcanic, overwhelming dopamine flood of cocaine or methamphetamine. Something subtler, warmer, more like turning off the anxiety that was blocking pleasure than actively creating pleasure itself. Users who discovered this effect described it in remarkably consistent terms. The high from gabapentin, particularly at doses above what was prescribed, produced a sensation of calm euphoria, a loosening of tension, a softening of edges, a feeling that the weight of everything had been temporarily lifted. People compared it to the early stages of alcohol intoxication without the nausea. Others described it as the anxiety relief of a benzodiazepine but without the sedation. One phrase appeared again and again in online forums and clinical interviews. It felt like being wrapped in a warm blanket. Not ecstatic, not overwhelming, just deeply, profoundly okay. That quality, the feeling of being okay, is extraordinarily dangerous in a population that has rarely felt okay. The pharmacokinetics of gabapentin contain a design flaw that no one thought to worry about when the drug was created for epilepsy patients who took it carefully 3 times a day under medical supervision. The drug is absorbed through the small intestine via a saturable transport mechanism, meaning the gut can only absorb so much at once. At normal prescription doses, this isn't a problem, but at higher doses, absorption becomes unpredictable and inconsistent. A 300 mg pill might be absorbed at 60% efficiency. A 600 mg dose might only be absorbed at 40%. This ceiling on oral absorption meant that for someone chasing a stronger effect, simply taking more pills didn't reliably produce a proportionally stronger high. Snorting changed the equation entirely. Insufflation, the clinical term for snorting, bypasses the gut completely. The drug absorbs directly through the nasal mucosa into the bloodstream and reaches the brain significantly faster than oral ingestion. The onset time compresses from roughly 1 to 2 hours down to minutes. The peak concentration spikes sharply rather than rising gradually. The result is an experience that is qualitatively different from swallowing the pill, not just stronger, but faster, more intense, more clearly euphoric, more obviously a high rather than medication doing its job quietly in the background. This is why people snort gabapentin. Not because they're reckless, because it works better that way, and the brain doesn't care about the distinction between a patient and an addict. The combination problem is where gabapentin stopped being just an emerging drug of misuse and became a genuine killer. Alone, at recreational doses, gabapentin is rarely directly fatal. The drug has a relatively wide safety margin when taken by itself. But the brain seeks combinations, and gabapentin combined with other central nervous system depressants produces effects that are wildly disproportionate to what either substance does alone. With opioids, the interaction is particularly lethal. Both drugs depress the central nervous system, both slow respiratory rate. Individually, each can be managed. Together, they don't simply add, they multiply. A dose of heroin that a regular user could handle safely becomes potentially fatal when gabapentin is already in the bloodstream. The respiratory depression compounds. Breathing slows further, then becomes shallow, then stops. The naloxone that reverses opioid overdose does nothing for the gabapentin component. Emergency responders who administer naloxone and watch a patient revive might not realize the person is still carrying gabapentin's suppressive effect. The patient can rearrest minutes after being saved. With alcohol, the synergy is different but equally unpredictable. Gabapentin enhances the sedative effects of alcohol dramatically, creating a state of impairment that bears no relationship to the actual amount consumed. Someone who has taken gabapentin and drinks 2 beers can be functionally as impaired as someone who drank an entire bottle of whiskey. The danger is that neither the person nor anyone observing them necessarily understands what they're actually dealing with. The invisibility of gabapentin in toxicology screening created a feedback loop that accelerated misuse in one very specific population before spreading everywhere else. Standard workplace drug tests, the 5-panel or 10-panel urine screens used by employers, probation officers and drug courts, do not test for gabapentin. The drug requires a separate specific assay to detect, and most routine screening programs never added it because gabapentin wasn't scheduled, wasn't considered a drug of abuse, and adding tests cost money. People on parole figured this out fast. People in drug court figured it out. People in addiction treatment programs who were being monitored for opioid use figured it out. Here was a substance that produced a genuine, recognizable high, calming, euphoric, anxiety-dissolving, and left no trace in the tests that were supposed to catch them. The implications were immediate and practical. Gabapentin became the drug of choice for anyone who needed to get high without getting caught. This wasn't a marginal phenomenon. Reports from parole officers, drug court administrators, and addiction treatment counselors began accumulating through the early 2000s. Clients who were testing clean on opioids, but behaving in ways that suggested intoxication. Clients who admitted, when pressed, that gabapentin was available everywhere in their social networks and cost almost nothing. In some cities, a single 600 milligram gabapentin pill was selling for 50 cents to $1 on the street, cheaper than a beer, more effective for some purposes, and completely invisible to the surveillance apparatus designed to keep people in recovery accountable. The online communities that formed around gabapentin misuse in the early 2000s reveal something important about the nature of the drug's appeal that clinical literature tends to miss. Forums on Reddit, Blue Light, and other harm reduction platforms filled with detailed, surprisingly thoughtful accounts of gabapentin use, dosing guides, combination warnings, discussions of tolerance and withdrawal. The people writing these posts were not stereotypical drug abusers by any common cultural definition. Many were chronic pain patients who had discovered that their medication did something extra at higher doses. Others were people with severe anxiety who found that gabapentin worked better than anything their psychiatrist had tried. Some were people in recovery from opioids who had found gabapentin blunted the psychological ache of sobriety. What ran through almost every account was a variation of the same theme. This drug was the first thing that made life feel bearable, not exciting, not euphoric in any dramatic sense, just tolerable, just quiet. For people carrying unmanaged pain, undiagnosed anxiety, untreated trauma, gabapentin was filling a hole that nothing legitimate had reached. That is not a description of recreational drug abuse in any simple sense. It is a description of a system that had failed to treat real suffering, and a molecule that stepped into the gap and did the job, with a hidden price tag that no one had disclosed. The price, it turned out, had been accumulating for years, and in certain corners of America, the bill was already coming due. Pfizer inherited a problem when it absorbed Warner Lambert in 2000, but it also inherited a gold mine. Gabapentin, sold under the brand name Neurontin, was already generating over $2 billion in annual revenue, remarkable for a drug whose approved uses were narrow and whose patient population, epileptics and people with shingles nerve pain, was relatively small. The math didn't add up, honestly. $2 billion from epilepsy and postherpetic neuralgia was impossible. The money was coming from somewhere else entirely, and everyone in the industry knew exactly where. The off-label prescribing machine that Park Davis had built throughout the 1990s was a masterpiece of pharmaceutical influence, and understanding how it worked is essential to understanding how gabapentin ended up in the hands of tens of millions of people who had no medical reason to be taking it. The strategy had multiple interlocking components, each one individually deniable, collectively devastating. Sales representatives were given financial incentives to promote gabapentin for unapproved uses. They weren't just suggesting it. They were trained with specific scripts, specific clinical talking points, specific responses to physician objections. The message was consistent across thousands of separate conversations happening simultaneously in doctors' offices across the country. Gabapentin is safe, effective, and appropriate for a wide range of pain and psychiatric conditions. The fact that this message was not supported by the clinical evidence was a detail that never made it into the pitch. The medical education component of the campaign was more sophisticated and in many ways more effective than direct sales pressure. Park Davis funded continuing medical education events, conferences, symposia, dinners, where physicians received legitimate CME credits for attending lectures that were, in practice, promotional presentations for off-label gabapentin use. These weren't obviously corrupt events. They happened at respected academic institutions. They featured credentialed speakers. The content was wrapped in the language and formatting of genuine medical education. What physicians didn't always know was that the speakers had been recruited and paid by the pharmaceutical company, that the content had been shaped to emphasize favorable data and minimize unfavorable findings, and that the entire educational architecture had been designed not to inform clinical practice, but to change prescribing behavior in one specific direction. By the time a physician left one of these events, they believed, sincerely based on what they'd been told by apparent experts, that gabapentin was a versatile, safe tool for managing conditions that had previously been difficult to treat. The ghostwriting operation ran parallel to this. Studies favourable to gabapentin were written by pharmaceutical company employees or contractors, then published in peer-reviewed journals under the names of academic physicians who had agreed, for payment or professional consideration, to list themselves as authors. These studies weren't fabricated, the underlying data was real. But the framing, the conclusions, and the emphasis were shaped by people whose professional obligation was to the drug's commercial success, not to scientific accuracy. When other physicians searched the literature on gabapentin, they found a body of evidence that had been curated to tell a particular story. The 2004 criminal plea changed the legal landscape without changing anything on the ground. Pfizer paid $430 million, the largest criminal fine in pharmaceutical history at that point, and signed a corporate integrity agreement promising to reform its marketing practices. The agreement said nothing about the prescribing habits that had already been established. It said nothing about the physicians who'd been trained over a decade to reach for gabapentin instinctively. It said nothing about the patients who were already taking it, or the clinical culture that had normalized its broad use. Within a year of the settlement, gabapentin prescriptions were still rising. The off-label prescribing that the fine was supposed to punish continued, legally now, because once a physician genuinely believes a drug is appropriate for a condition, they can prescribe it for that condition regardless of FDA approval. The marketing campaign had done its job so thoroughly that it had made itself unnecessary. The beliefs it had implanted were self-sustaining. Generic gabapentin entered the market in 2004, the same year as the criminal settlement. This was not a coincidence of timing, but an inevitability of patent expiration. Generic drugs cost a fraction of the branded version, which meant insurance companies covered them readily, and patients could afford them without significant cost sharing. A 30-day supply of generic gabapentin could cost less than $10. The price collapse democratized access in the most literal sense. Gabapentin became available to almost anyone who could get a prescription, and getting a prescription had been made extraordinarily easy by the prescribing culture that had been methodically constructed over the previous decade. The mechanics of how prescriptions became street supply operated through several simultaneous channels, none of which required criminal intent to function. The most straightforward was simple overprescription. A patient prescribed 900 milligrams daily. 300 milligram pills might take only one or two, accumulating a surplus over weeks and months. Medicine cabinets across America filled with gabapentin that wasn't being used, sitting in orange bottles that nobody thought to lock away because nobody thought gabapentin was a drug worth worrying about. Pill mills, the clinics that had operated openly in states like Florida and Kentucky, writing opioid prescriptions with minimal medical oversight, didn't disappear when opioid crackdowns began. They adapted. Gabapentin required no DEA registration to prescribe, no special prescription form, no record in a controlled substance database in most states. A clinic that had been writing OxyContin scripts and found that avenue closing simply added gabapentin to its offerings. Patients who came looking for opioids and left with gabapentin, sometimes alongside opioids, sometimes instead of them, fed both the legitimate demand and the street supply simultaneously. The doctor shopping problem that had defined opioid overprescription was structurally impossible to address with gabapentin, because the infrastructure to detect it didn't exist. Prescription drug monitoring programs, the state databases that tracked opioid prescriptions and flagged patients visiting multiple prescribers, did not include gabapentin in most states. A patient could visit 5 physicians in a single week, collect 5 separate gabapentin prescriptions from 5 separate pharmacies, and generate no alert, no flag, no concern anywhere in the system. the database was watching for the wrong drug. In Appalachian Kentucky, the intersection of these forces produced something that local pharmacists started noticing before any official body did. Quantities of gabapentin being dispensed in certain counties bore no relationship to the medical need those counties could plausibly represent. Small rural communities, towns of a few thousand people, economically hollowed out by the decline of coal, already devastated by a decade of opioid addiction, were consuming gabapentin at rates that made no clinical sense. Some pharmacists started asking questions. They flagged unusual prescription patterns to their state boards. They noted that the same patients who had previously come in with opioid prescriptions were now arriving with gabapentin prescriptions, sometimes from the same clinics, sometimes from new providers who had appeared recently in the area. The request for early refills, the cash payments that bypassed insurance, the clusters of prescriptions coming from facilities that no one in the local medical community seemed to know. These were familiar signals, the same signals that had preceded the OxyContin crisis by a few years. The response from oversight bodies was measured, cautious, and slow. Gabapentin wasn't scheduled. There was no legal framework to treat it the way opioids were treated. And the pharmaceutical and medical establishment was still, in 2010 and 2011 and 2012, actively pushing back against the characterization of gabapentin as a drug capable of misuse. The evidence was anecdotal. The science said it wasn't addictive. The science, as far as most people in authority were concerned, was still settled. Meanwhile, the pills kept moving. Out of clinics, into pockets, across county lines and state borders, from medicine cabinets into hands that had never seen a prescription. The machine that had been built to sell a drug to as many people as possible was functioning exactly as designed. It just wasn't doing what anyone officially admitted it was doing, and in certain communities the consequences of that machine were about to become impossible to ignore. Eastern Kentucky doesn't look like a place where pharmaceutical history gets made. It looks like a place where history happens to people who had no say in it. The mountains are beautiful, and the towns between them have been dying slowly for decades. First the coal jobs left, then the young people followed the jobs, and what remained was an aging population with chronic health problems, limited access to medical care, and an opioid crisis that had already taken more from these communities than most outsiders could comprehend. By 2012, the OxyContin crackdown was in full effect. Purdue Pharma had reformulated its flagship pill to be abuse deterrent. Crushing it now produced a gummy, unsnortable mass rather than a fine powder. The DEA had tightened prescription monitoring. Pill mills were being raided and shut down. The political and public health establishment declared progress. In Washington, graphs showed opioid prescription rates declining. The crisis, the data suggested, was being addressed. In Pike County, Kentucky, the overdose rate went up. What the graphs in Washington couldn't show was what was happening at street level in communities where addiction was already deeply embedded. Cracking down on prescription opioids didn't eliminate the need those opioids had been filling. It just redirected people toward whatever was available. Some moved to heroin, which flooded in from Mexican cartels to fill the void left by declining OxyContin supplies. Others moved to fentanyl. And a significant portion discovered that gabapentin, which was everywhere and cost almost nothing, could bridge the gap between doses, stretch a small supply of opioids further, or in some cases replace them partially. The potentiation effect, gabapentin's ability to amplify the effect of opioids, made it extraordinarily valuable in a supply-constrained environment. A person with access to half the heroin they used to use could approximate their previous high by combining it with gabapentin. The math was brutally practical. Less of the expensive, harder-to-obtain drug, combined with more of the cheap, easy-to-get drug, produced a comparable result. This wasn't chemistry experimentation by curious people. It was resource management by desperate ones. Dealers understood the market before public health officials understood the problem. Gabapentin began appearing not as a separate product, but as an additive, mixed into heroin supplies, sold in combination packages, recommended as a complement rather than an alternative. The street trade adapted with a speed and flexibility that no regulatory response could match, because the street trade had no committees to convene, no studies to commission, no political considerations to weigh. It simply responded to what people wanted. The emergency rooms of rural Appalachian hospitals became the first official data collection points for what was actually happening. Physicians treating overdose patients began noticing a pattern that didn't fit the standard opioid overdose profile. Patients were arriving unconscious, with suppressed respiration, classic overdose presentation, but toxicology screens were coming back negative or low positive for opioids. Something else was in the picture. Expanded toxicology panels that specifically tested for gabapentin started revealing it in patient after patient. More disturbing was the clinical behavior of these overdoses. Standard opioid overdoses respond to naloxone, the reversal drug that emergency responders carry. Administer naloxone, block the opioid receptors, patient regains consciousness. The protocol is reliable enough that paramedics use it in the field with high confidence. But patients who had combined gabapentin with opioids were responding to naloxone incompletely. They would partially revive, then deteriorate again. Some required multiple doses of naloxone. Some required intubation and mechanical ventilation when naloxone alone wasn't sufficient. The reason was pharmacological and straightforward once understood. Naloxone reverses opioids. It does nothing to gabapentin. A patient who had taken both drugs still had a full load of gabapentin suppressing their respiratory drive, even after the opioid component had been reversed. Emergency physicians were essentially fighting with one hand tied behind their back, reversing half of what was killing the patient while the other half continued its work unimpeded. The coroner started talking to each other. This is not a metaphor. The actual mechanism by which the gabapentin crisis became visible in Appalachia was informal communication between medical examiners and forensic pathologists who were seeing the same thing independently and comparing notes. A coroner in Pike County, Kentucky, began specifically requesting gabapentin testing on overdose cases in 2012 after seeing it appear unexpectedly in expanded panels. What came back was startling. Gabapentin was present in a substantial proportion of overdose deaths, not as the sole substance, but as a consistent co-intoxicant. The death certificates for these cases listed opioid overdose as the cause of death, which was technically accurate. Opioids had been present. Opioids had been the proximate cause of respiratory failure. But the gabapentin had been the accelerant. It had taken a survivable opioid dose and made it fatal. The death certificates didn't capture this. The national statistics didn't capture this. The databases that policymakers used to understand the overdose crisis were systematically blind to gabapentin's role. This data gap had consequences that compounded over years. If gabapentin didn't appear in the overdose statistics, there was no statistical case for treating it as a crisis. If there was no statistical case, there was no political urgency. If there was no political urgency, there was no regulatory response. The bodies were accumulating in a category that the system hadn't built a box for. Recovery communities in Appalachia encountered gabapentin as a threat from a direction they hadn't anticipated. The opioid treatment infrastructure that had been slowly built in these communities, methadone clinics, buprenorphine prescribers, peer support programs, was designed around opioid addiction. The assumption was that if you could stabilize someone on medication-assisted treatment and keep them away from opioids, you were winning. Gabapentin violated that assumption without technically breaking any rule. Patients on methadone maintenance could take gabapentin without triggering a positive drug test at most clinics. Patients on buprenorphine could combine it with their prescribed medication. The combination of buprenorphine and gabapentin didn't produce a dramatic high, but it produced something, enough sedation, enough blunting of psychological discomfort, enough relief from the grinding anxiety of early recovery to make the temptation real. People who were genuinely trying to get clean were using gabapentin as a partial substitute, a way of managing the parts of addiction that medication-assisted treatment didn't address. Treatment counselors watched this happen and had almost no tools to address it. They couldn't test for gabapentin with standard panels. They couldn't point to a clear clinical policy on gabapentin use during recovery, because no such policy had been formally developed. They were dealing with a drug that existed in a regulatory and clinical blind spot, present enough to cause harm, invisible enough to escape consequence. The state of Kentucky became the first in the nation to add gabapentin to its prescription drug monitoring program in 2017. The decision came after years of accumulating evidence, the coroner reports, the emergency room data, the treatment program observations, reached a critical mass that made inaction politically untenable. When researchers ran the state's first comprehensive analysis of gabapentin's presence in overdose deaths, the number that emerged from the data was not the number anyone had expected. Gabapentin had been present in over a quarter of all drug overdose deaths in Kentucky in the years preceding the analysis. A quarter. In a state that had been at the epicenter of the opioid crisis for over a decade, a drug that the medical establishment had classified as non-addictive and low risk had been quietly present in the toxicology of 1 in 4 people who died of a drug overdose. The number landed in the public health community like a stone into still water. The ripples moved outward immediately, to other states, to federal agencies, to researchers who began pulling their own data and looking for the same pattern. What they found when they looked was that Kentucky wasn't an outlier. It was a leading indicator. The same story was waiting in the data everywhere that someone thought to look for it, which for too long almost nobody had. There is a particular economy that develops inside correctional facilities, invisible to the outside world and governed by rules that have nothing to do with any law. Cigarettes used to be the universal currency. Small, portable, divisible, universally desired. When smoking bans swept through prison systems in the United States, United Kingdom and Australia through the 2000s and 2010s, that economy didn't collapse. It reorganized. It found a new commodity. And in facility after facility, across multiple countries simultaneously, the commodity it settled on was gabapentin. The transition happened with the quiet efficiency of any market responding to supply and demand. Gabapentin had qualities that made it nearly ideal as a prison currency. It was small, it was legal, it could enter a facility through official medical channels, and it produced an effect that made the grinding psychological weight of incarceration briefly, mercifully lighter. A drug that made time pass faster was not an abstraction inside a cell block. It was a survival mechanism. The pathway into facilities was embarrassingly direct. Inmates with legitimate medical needs, epilepsy, nerve damage from injuries, chronic pain conditions, were prescribed gabapentin by prison physicians operating under the same clinical assumptions that had driven its explosion in the outside world. The drug was dispensed legally, through the prison pharmacy, to patients who genuinely needed it. What happened after dispensing was where the system broke down completely. The practice known as cheeking became standard procedure for gabapentin in prison populations so quickly that correctional health staff were caught entirely off guard. Inmates learned to hold pills under the tongue or inside the cheek during pill call. the supervised medication administration process where nurses or officers watched each prisoner swallow. The technique required practice but wasn't particularly difficult to master. A slight turn of the head, a sip of water that moved the pill back rather than down, a convincing swallow motion. Officers watching dozens of inmates in succession, under time pressure, in facilities perpetually short-staffed, couldn't realistically verify every swallow. The cheeked pills were later dissolved in small amounts of liquid and either consumed at a chosen time, traded for other goods, or crushed and snorted. The value of a single gabapentin capsule inside some UK facilities reached levels that would have been absurd in any other context. Reports from correctional officers and prison health workers described inmates with gabapentin prescriptions becoming figures of power and danger overnight, targets for extortion by those who wanted their supply, and sources of influence over those who needed it. Prison physicians faced a dilemma with no clean solution. Denying gabapentin to inmates with documented epilepsy or severe nerve pain meant denying legitimate medical treatment to sick people, which created liability, violated medical ethics, and invited legal challenge. Continuing to prescribe it meant feeding a black market that was destabilizing entire wings of facilities. Some institutions switched to liquid formulations that were harder to cheek. Others implemented observed swallowing protocols with mouth checks. Each countermeasure triggered a countermeasure in return. Inmates found ways around liquid formulations, ways around mouth checks, ways around everything the system devised because the incentive to find those ways was enormous and the ingenuity available was considerable. The United Kingdom became the country where the prison gabapentin crisis was documented most thoroughly, partly because the UK had centralised data collection systems that made patterns visible faster than the fragmented American system could. By 2017, gabapentin and its chemical cousin pregabalin, a related drug with similar effects, marketed under the brand name Lyrica, had become the dominant drugs of misuse in British prisons, surpassing heroin and synthetic cannabinoids in many facilities. A study published that year analysed drug-related deaths in UK prisons over a multi-year period and found gabapentin present in over 20% of cases, not as a curiosity, not as a trace finding. As a significant contributing factor, consistently present alongside other substances in deaths that had been officially classified under other primary causes. The number shocked British prison health authorities, in part because gabapentin had only been placed under any legal control in the UK in 2019, meaning that for the years covered by the study, it had been a completely unscheduled substance flowing into correctional facilities through legitimate prescriptions with no special monitoring or restriction. The delay between the evidence and the regulatory response, years of documented deaths, years of published research, followed eventually by a scheduling decision, would become a familiar rhythm in the gabapentin story across every country that encountered it. What the prison data revealed extended beyond the walls of correctional facilities. Incarceration and release create a circulation between the prison population and the communities those prisons draw from, disproportionately poor, disproportionately rural, disproportionately already affected by addiction and limited healthcare access. Knowledge of gabapentin's effects, its availability, its invisibility to drug tests, travelled with people when they were released. The prison population, in this sense, functioned as an accelerator, compressing the timeline of a drug spread from niche knowledge to common practice. Men and women released from facilities where gabapentin had been the dominant currency returned to communities that already had gabapentin everywhere because of the prescription machine. The knowledge of how to use it, how to combine it, how to obtain it outside legitimate channels, layered onto a supply that was already abundant. The street price of gabapentin in communities near large correctional facilities tracked closely with the prescribing rates in nearby clinics, because the clinics were the supply and the facilities were amplifying the demand signal back into the surrounding community. Australian correctional systems encountered the identical pattern on a slightly delayed timeline, following the same sequence: expanded medical prescribing, discovery of misuse potential by the inmate population, rapid spread through facility drug economies, climbing death counts, slow official response. A 2019 analysis of Queensland prison health data found gabapentin prescriptions had increased by over 300% in a 5-year period, far outpacing any plausible increase in the medical conditions that warranted it. The numbers implied that a significant proportion of prescriptions were being diverted rather than consumed therapeutically. Canadian federal prisons reported similar findings. The pattern was consistent enough across different countries, different prison systems, different cultural contexts, that it could no longer be explained by local factors. Something about gabapentin itself, its effect profile, its pharmacokinetics, its invisibility to standard detection, made it an ideal prison drug regardless of geography. The drug wasn't being used this way because of some unique feature of American poverty or British prison culture. It was being used this way because of what it was, chemically and experientially, and because the systems designed to prevent drug misuse had been built for a different era and a different list of substances. The correctional health workers who dealt with gabapentin withdrawal in releasing inmates added another dimension to the crisis that received almost no public attention. Inmates who had been using gabapentin heavily inside, whether through legitimate prescriptions, diverted pills, or both, frequently experienced significant withdrawal symptoms when released and lost access to their supply. The withdrawal was disorienting, physically distressing, and in some cases dangerous. But because gabapentin was still classified as non-addictive in most clinical frameworks, and because most community health providers weren't trained to recognize gabapentin withdrawal, released inmates presenting with sweating, insomnia, anxiety, and tremors were frequently assessed for opioid withdrawal or psychiatric crisis, rather than the actual cause of their symptoms. Misdiagnosed withdrawal led to mistreated withdrawal. People who needed a carefully managed gabapentin taper received treatments aimed at the wrong substance, which didn't work, which led to continued suffering, which frequently led back to drug use as self-medication. The revolving door of incarceration and release spun faster, and gabapentin was one of the mechanisms keeping it turning. The correctional system had become both a mirror and an amplifier of the crisis unfolding outside its walls, reflecting the same failures of prescribing culture, regulatory oversight, and clinical understanding that were playing out in suburban doctors' offices and rural emergency rooms, but with the additional pressure of confinement, coercion, and a population with almost no access to alternatives. Inside those facilities, the consequences of every upstream decision about gabapentin, to market it aggressively, to prescribe it broadly, to classify it as safe, to leave it unmonitored, arrived compressed and accelerated, stripped of the buffers that wealth and social stability provide on the outside. The most statistically significant gabapentin user in America does not live in a prison cell or a tent under a highway overpass. She lives in a 3-bedroom house in a mid-sized city, drives a reliable car, holds a steady job, and has health insurance. Her prescription is legitimate. Her doctor is not running a pill mill. Her pharmacy is a national chain with a loyalty card program. Nothing about her situation, viewed from the outside, resembles a drug problem in any way that American culture has been trained to recognize. She started taking gabapentin 2 years ago for nerve pain following a minor surgery. It worked. The burning sensation in her leg that had made sleep impossible faded within the first week. Her doctor was pleased, renewed the prescription at her follow-up, and moved on to the next patient. Nobody sat her down and explained what would happen if she stopped. Nobody told her that 3 months of daily use was enough to create physical dependence. Nobody warned her that the anxiety she'd started feeling on the day she forgot a dose wasn't her underlying anxiety disorder reasserting itself. It was the drug leaving her system and her brain screaming for it back. This is not an unusual story. It is, by the available data, the most common one. The invisibility of suburban gabapentin dependence rests on several interlocking failures that are structural rather than individual. Workplace drug testing programs, which create at least a theoretical accountability mechanism for illicit drug use, don't test for gabapentin. A nurse taking double her prescribed dose through a night shift, an accountant who has quietly escalated from 300 to 1,200 milligrams daily over 18 months, a teacher who takes gabapentin before parent-teacher conferences to manage the anxiety. None of these people will be caught by the systems designed to catch drug use in professional environments. Physical appearance provides no signal either. Gabapentin dependency at therapeutic or moderately elevated doses doesn't produce the visible deterioration associated with stimulants or heavy opioid use. There is no dramatic weight loss, no skin damage, no obvious intoxication visible to colleagues or family members. The behavioral changes are subtle: slight mood flattening, increased irritability on low-dose days, social withdrawal that looks like introversion. These are changes that the people experiencing them attribute to stress, aging, personality, anything except a dependency on a prescription medication their doctor gave them and told them was safe. The medical appointment that would catch the problem doesn't happen because nothing looks wrong from the outside, and from the inside the person has been told, explicitly, repeatedly, by authority figures in white coats, that gabapentin is not addictive. When the brain signals distress without the drug, the interpretation is almost never "I am dependent on gabapentin." It is almost always "my pain is returning," or "my anxiety is getting worse," or "I need to keep taking this because I need this." The drug has made itself invisible inside the narrative the patient already had about themselves. Healthcare workers occupy a specific and particularly acute position within this population. Nurses, pharmacists, paramedics, and physicians have easier access to medications than almost anyone outside the pharmaceutical supply chain. They understand drugs mechanically, how they work, what the doses mean, how to manage them, which creates a paradoxical vulnerability. Knowledge that should be protective becomes the tool used to rationalize escalation. A nurse who knows that gabapentin's maximum prescribed dose is 3,600 milligrams daily can take 1,200 milligrams and tell herself she's still within the therapeutic range, technically, and therefore fine. Healthcare workers also face occupational conditions that make gabapentin's specific effect profile dangerously appealing. The anxiety relief, the blunting of hypervigilance, the ability to be present in a high-stress environment without being consumed by it. For someone working 12-hour shifts in an emergency department or an ICU, gabapentin can feel less like a drug and more like a necessary tool for professional survival. The boundary between use and misuse blurs in occupational contexts where stress is relentless, and the drug's effects are framed as functional rather than recreational. The phenomenon is documented but systematically undercounted because the medical profession's internal accountability structures, licensing boards, peer assistance programs, supervisory oversight, were built around the substances that were recognized as dangerous. Gabapentin wasn't on the list. It wasn't being watched for. Healthcare workers who developed dependence and eventually sought help frequently reported that their colleagues had known something was wrong for months before any intervention occurred, because nobody had identified gabapentin as the thing to look for. The college student population encountered gabapentin along a completely different vector. social rather than medical. On campuses where pharmaceutical misuse was already normalized around Adderall and benzodiazepines, gabapentin appeared as an accessible, cheap, test-invisible addition to the available palette. Its combination with alcohol was particularly appealing to a demographic that drinks heavily and seeks drugs that enhance rather than complicate that experience. The amplification effect, 2 drinks feeling like 6, a manageable social anxiety becoming something close to confidence, made it attractive at parties, before performances, during exam periods when anxiety ran high. Campus health services began encountering gabapentin in student populations around 2014 and 2015, initially in anecdotal reports from counsellors and then in peer-reviewed surveys that captured self-reported misuse rates. The numbers varied by institution and region, but the trend line was consistent. Gabapentin misuse on college campuses was rising annually, tracking closely with the drug's increasing availability in the general population. Students whose parents had gabapentin in the medicine cabinet knew it was there. Students with their own legitimate prescriptions shared pills the way any prescription gets shared in a college dormitory. The campus context added a dimension that the rural Appalachian context didn't: the internet. Online communities discussing gabapentin as a recreational substance were more accessible to college students than to any other demographic, and those communities had developed sophisticated collective knowledge about dosing, combinations, and managing the experience. Information that had previously circulated through direct personal contact could now be discovered by anyone curious enough to search for it. The drug's user base expanded not just through social networks, but through information networks, and those networks had no geographic boundary. The retiree population represented another invisible frontier. Older adults are prescribed gabapentin at high rates. Nerve pain, restless leg syndrome, and the various neuropathic conditions associated with aging make them an enormous market segment. They are also a population for whom the social supports that might notice escalating drug use are often absent. Living alone, with less frequent medical contact than their health needs warrant, and with the cultural assumption that medication use is simply a feature of aging rather than a potential problem, older gabapentin users who developed dependence were functionally undetectable within the existing system. Geriatric medicine specialists who began paying attention to gabapentin in the early 2000s raised concerns about cognitive effects that standard prescribing guidelines hadn't adequately addressed. At higher doses, gabapentin produces sedation and cognitive slowing that in elderly patients could present as dementia-like symptoms: confusion, memory problems, difficulty concentrating. Patients were sometimes referred to neurologists for dementia workups when the actual cause of their cognitive decline was the gabapentin they had been taking for their nerve pain. The drug was causing the symptom it was being investigated for. Nobody thought to check the prescription first. Falls in elderly gabapentin users were another documented but underappreciated risk. The sedation and balance impairment the drug produced at moderate doses significantly increased fall risk in a population already vulnerable to catastrophic fractures. Studies published through the 2000s documented the association repeatedly. The clinical guidelines lagged behind the research. Prescribers who'd been told gabapentin was safe continued prescribing it to patients whose safety it was quietly compromising. The invisible addicts were everywhere, distributed evenly across the demographics that no one was surveilling, hiding in plain sight behind the legitimacy of a prescription and the authority of a medical system that had told them, with great confidence, that what they were taking was not something to worry about. The first thing that happens when gabapentin leaves the body is that the brain doesn't understand what's occurring. This isn't metaphorical. The neurons that had reorganized themselves around the drug's constant presence, recalibrating calcium channel activity, adjusting baseline excitability, building a new equilibrium that incorporated the drug as a structural assumption, suddenly find themselves operating without the chemical architecture they had quietly come to depend on. The result is a rebound excitation. Every system the drug had been suppressing comes back louder than before. For most patients who experienced this, it arrived without a name. Their doctor had stopped the prescription, sometimes abruptly, because there was no clinical protocol requiring a taper, because the drug was officially non-addictive, because tapering was considered unnecessary overhead for a medication with no abuse potential. The patient went from taking gabapentin daily to not taking it, and within 12 to 48 hours, something went profoundly wrong. Their skin began to feel wrong, hypersensitive, crawling. Sleep became impossible despite exhaustion. Anxiety arrived not as a familiar background hum but as a physical sensation, electric and unrelenting. Then came the sweating, the tremors, the nausea, the heart racing at rest. A significant number of these patients went to emergency rooms. What they described, acute anxiety, physical agitation, trembling, insomnia, a sense of impending doom that felt organic rather than psychological, was a symptom cluster that overlapped with several conditions. Benzodiazepine withdrawal, alcohol withdrawal, thyroid storm, panic disorder with somatic features. Emergency physicians ran through the differential diagnoses methodically. They ordered thyroid panels, cardiac workups, psychiatric evaluations. Many patients were admitted for observation under a psychiatric diagnosis. Antipsychotics were prescribed. Benzodiazepines were administered to control the agitation. Some of those benzodiazepine treatments worked temporarily, because benzodiazepines operate on adjacent neurological pathways and blunted the rebound excitation. This became a diagnostic trap. The treatment that partially worked reinforced the wrong diagnosis. Patients were sent home with benzodiazepine prescriptions for anxiety disorders they didn't have, while the actual cause of their crisis went unidentified, undocumented, and unaddressed. The patients who experienced seizures during gabapentin withdrawal faced an even more dangerous version of the same diagnostic failure. Seizures in someone with no seizure history, with no gabapentin listed as a concern because the drug was non-addictive, were worked up as new-onset epilepsy. Neurologists ordered MREs, EEGs, extensive imaging. Some patients were started on anticonvulsant medications, not uncommonly, gabapentin itself, because it was an anticonvulsant, closing a circular loop that would have been darkly comic if people's lives hadn't been at stake. The medical literature on gabapentin withdrawal existed, but it was sparse, scattered, and consistently underemphasized. Case reports had been appearing since the late 1990s, individual physicians documenting unusual withdrawal presentations in patients who stopped gabapentin abruptly, publishing in journals with limited circulation, flagging a pattern that the pharmaceutical establishment had no interest in aggregating into a systematic finding. Each case report existed in isolation. No one was required to connect them. No one with resources was motivated to connect them. Pfizer's clinical trials had not been designed to detect dependence. The trial durations were too short, typically 8 to 12 weeks, to capture the neurological adaptations that develop over months of continuous use. The patient populations in those trials had been carefully selected to exclude people with substance use histories, which meant the population most likely to show dependence-related findings had been screened out before the research began. The methodology that had established gabapentin's safety was structurally incapable of finding the problem it was being used to rule out. This was not unique to gabapentin. It was the standard framework for pharmaceutical safety research at the time, a framework that defined addiction primarily through observable drug-seeking behavior in the short term rather than through the neurological changes that develop over longer exposure. By the definitions being applied, gabapentin wasn't addictive. By the definitions that mattered to the people sweating through sheets at 3 a.m, the story was different. The research that eventually began documenting gabapentin dependence systematically came not from pharmaceutical companies, but from addiction medicine specialists who were seeing the clinical reality and working backward to understand it. A 2010 study found that physical dependence could develop after as little as 3 to 4 weeks of regular use at standard therapeutic doses, not recreational doses, not misuse doses, the doses printed on the prescription label, taken as directed, for the duration of a typical prescription, 3 to 4 weeks. That was the standard length of a post-surgical pain prescription. That was the length of a trial run for nerve pain management. That was the exact window in which millions of patients were being initiated on gabapentin every year, with no warning that stopping it might not be straightforward, with no tapering instructions in case they wanted to discontinue, with no framework to understand the symptoms they would experience if they tried. The finding hit addiction medicine circles with considerable force. It implied that the population of people with clinically significant gabapentin dependence was not a small subset of misusers. It was a substantial proportion of the tens of millions of people taking it as prescribed. The drug had been handed to patients across 30 years with the assurance that it was safe to stop, and the research now suggested that for a meaningful number of those patients, stopping it without medical supervision carried real risk of serious withdrawal. Patient advocacy online began organizing around gabapentin withdrawal in the early 2000s, driven by people who had experienced severe discontinuation symptoms and found no acknowledgement in their medical interactions. Online forums accumulated thousands of accounts, detailed, consistent, geographically distributed, describing identical symptom patterns following gabapentin cessation. The quality of these accounts was striking. These were not vague complaints. They were precise, clinically coherent descriptions of a recognizable syndrome, written by people who had no reason to fabricate them and no shared financial interest in the outcome. Physicians who read these accounts and compared them to the clinical literature began raising concerns formally. Letters were published in medical journals. Clinical conferences featured presentations on gabapentin discontinuation syndrome as an emerging concern. The accumulation of evidence reached a point where dismissal required active effort rather than passive inattention. The pharmaceutical industry's response was to fund studies that applied narrow definitions of dependence and withdrawal, producing findings that minimized the prevalence and severity of the syndrome. The scientific literature became contested territory, studies showing significant withdrawal risk on one side, industry-adjacent studies showing minimal risk on the other, with practicing physicians caught in the middle, trying to determine which evidence to apply to the patient sitting in front of them. The psychological dimension of gabapentin withdrawal received even less attention than the physical symptoms. Patients who had been taking the drug long-term reported that discontinuation produced depressive episodes of a severity that bore no relationship to their baseline mood. Some described suicidal ideation emerging in the first week after stopping, not as an expression of existing depression, but as a new phenomenon, arising suddenly in people with no prior suicidal history. The mechanism was neurological. The dopamine pathways that gabapentin had been influencing were destabilized during withdrawal, producing a neurochemical state that resembled severe depression without being the same thing. These patients went to their doctors and were often prescribed antidepressants, beginning a new pharmaceutical intervention for a condition that would have resolved with a properly managed gabapentin taper. Some were hospitalized. Some, without the vocabulary to explain that stopping a nerve pain medication had triggered suicidal thoughts, didn't seek help at all. The outcomes in that group were not systematically tracked, because the connection between gabapentin cessation and acute psychiatric crisis had not been formally established in the clinical guidelines that emergency physicians and psychiatrists were working from. The drug that had been prescribed to make people feel better was, in some cases, making them desperately ill in the process of leaving their bodies, and the system that had put it there had not built any pathway to bring them safely out the other side. In 2019, the DEA announced it was reviewing gabapentin for potential federal scheduling. The announcement was measured, bureaucratic, and long overdue. By that point, the drug had been implicated in thousands of deaths, documented as a significant driver of misuse in multiple countries, and scheduled independently by a growing list of states that had stopped waiting for federal action. The review process, the DEA indicated, would take time. Comprehensive evaluation of the evidence was required. Stakeholder input would be solicited. The appropriate regulatory channels would be followed. 6 years later, gabapentin remains federally unscheduled in the United States. That gap between documented evidence of harm and regulatory response is not an accident or an oversight. It is the predictable output of a system with competing pressures, conflicting incentives, and a structural bias toward inaction when the substance in question is simultaneously a legitimate medical tool for millions of patients and a dangerous drug of misuse for a smaller but significant minority. The DEA's scheduling decisions carry consequences that extend far beyond the substance being evaluated, and everyone with a stake in gabapentin's future understood exactly what those consequences would be. Federal scheduling under the Controlled Substances Act would place gabapentin in a category requiring DEA registration to prescribe, mandatory prescription monitoring, quantity limits, and the full administrative infrastructure that governs opioids and benzodiazepines. For the pharmaceutical companies manufacturing generic gabapentin, a market worth over $1 billion annually, scheduling meant reduced prescribing volume, increased regulatory compliance costs, and potential competition disadvantage against alternative treatments. Lobbying against scheduling was not merely self-interested, it was financially obligatory. For patient advocacy organizations representing people with epilepsy, fibromyalgia, and neuropathic pain, populations for whom gabapentin provided genuine, significant relief, federal scheduling raised legitimate fears. The opioid scheduling experience had shown that increased regulatory barriers didn't just reduce misuse, they reduced legitimate access. Patients in rural areas with limited provider options, patients whose insurance networks were narrow, patients who relied on the drug's low cost as a generic, all of them faced the prospect of a bureaucratic burden being inserted between them and a medication they genuinely needed. These concerns were real. They weren't manufactured by pharmaceutical interests, though pharmaceutical interests were happy to amplify them. The scheduling debate became a space where legitimate patient concerns and corporate profit motives occupied the same position, making it structurally impossible to separate one from the other in public discourse. The states that moved independently of the federal government created a patchwork regulatory landscape that illustrated both the potential and the limitations of decentralized drug policy. Kentucky led in 2017, adding gabapentin to its prescription monitoring program without formally scheduling it, a middle ground approach that required prescribers to check the PDMP before writing a prescription, but stopped short of imposing DEA-style controls. Tennessee, Michigan, Virginia, and several other states followed with varying approaches, some scheduling it outright, others opting for monitoring-only frameworks. The results were instructive and complicated. In states that implemented PDMP monitoring, prescribing patterns changed measurably. Doctor shopping declined. The most egregious outlier prescribers, those writing quantities that had no clinical justification, reduced their gabapentin output significantly when they knew it was being tracked. Early data from Kentucky suggested the monitoring program had reduced per capita gabapentin dispensing in counties that had previously shown the highest rates. But the border effect emerged almost immediately. Patients and dealers simply crossed state lines. A prescriber in a state without gabapentin monitoring was suddenly seeing patients from neighboring monitored states who traveled hours for a prescription they could no longer easily obtain locally. Pharmacies near state borders reported unusual spikes in gabapentin dispensing. The drug didn't disappear from affected communities. The geography of its acquisition shifted, adding inconvenience without eliminating access. Insurance companies responded to scheduling in monitored states with a swiftness that the public health response had never managed. Prior authorization requirements appeared. Coverage denials increased. Patients with documented legitimate medical needs, people who had been taking gabapentin for years for epilepsy, for severe neuropathic pain, for conditions where the drug genuinely worked, found themselves suddenly required to justify their prescriptions to insurance reviewers who were applying cost management criteria under the cover of safety concerns. The cruelty of this dynamic was that it hit the most legitimate users hardest. People obtaining gabapentin through illicit channels, buying it on the street, obtaining it through doctor shopping across state lines, were unaffected by insurance coverage decisions. The population that bore the full administrative weight of increased regulation was the population that had been following the rules all along. The chronic pain patient who had been stable on gabapentin for 5 years now needed monthly prior authorizations. The epilepsy patient whose seizures were controlled faced coverage gaps when the prior authorization process moved slowly. This was not an argument against regulation. It was an indictment of how regulation was being implemented, reactively, clumsily, without support structures for the patients who would be affected by the transition. The infrastructure of harm reduction had not been built before the hammer came down. The medical community's response to the emerging evidence about gabapentin divided along lines that reflected deeper fault lines in how medicine processes inconvenient information. A cohort of addiction medicine specialists, emergency physicians and forensic pathologists had been accumulating evidence for years and were calling loudly for prescribing guideline changes, mandatory tapering protocols, and comprehensive PDMP inclusion. They had the data, they had the clinical experience, they had the bodies. On the other side stood a larger and more diffuse group, general practitioners, pain specialists, neurologists, who had been prescribing gabapentin for years based on the established evidence base and whose clinical experience within their own patient populations didn't match the crisis narrative. Their patients were doing fine, the drug was helping. The misuse problem, as they encountered it, was something happening somewhere else, in different populations, not in the office with the patients they knew. Both groups were partially right, which made resolution harder than if one had been simply wrong. Gabapentin was genuinely helping millions of people. It was also genuinely harming a significant number. The overlap between these populations was messy, and the clinical guidelines that emerged from the tension between them reflected the mess. Cautious language about monitoring, vague recommendations about tapering, acknowledgement of dependence risk without specific protocols for managing it. The FDA's label changes for gabapentin, when they finally came, illustrated the distance between regulatory language and clinical reality. In 2019, the FDA required updated warnings about respiratory depression risk, the combination risk with opioids and CNS depressants that emergency physicians had been documenting for years. The warning was added to the prescribing information, printed in the package insert that almost no patient reads and that physicians consult selectively. The warning said nothing about dependence risk in explicit terms. It said nothing about the seizure risk associated with abrupt discontinuation. It said nothing about the need for tapering. The regulatory update that was supposed to address the mounting evidence of gabapentin's harm was, in practice, a note added to a document that the people most at risk would never see, warning about a risk that was only a fraction of the documented problem. Pharmaceutical companies complied with the label change because compliance was mandatory, and because the label change, as written, was the minimum possible acknowledgement of the maximum available evidence. The gap between what the science showed and what the label said remained wide enough to drive the entire crisis through without touching either wall. Millions of prescriptions continued to be written, millions of bottles continued to be filled, and the evidence of harm continued to accumulate in databases that no regulatory body was legally required to act on with any particular urgency. The system had looked at the problem, deliberated extensively, and produced a label change. The problem continued. Every death in the United States generates a document. A medical examiner or coroner fills out a form, selects a cause from a standardized list, and that selection becomes the permanent official record of how a human life ended. The death certificate is the foundation of public health data. It feeds the mortality statistics that epidemiologists use to track disease trends, that policymakers use to allocate resources, that researchers use to identify emerging crises. If the death certificate is wrong, everything built on it is wrong. For gabapentin, the death certificate was almost always wrong. The mechanism of the error wasn't fraud or negligence. It was a structural feature of how polydrug overdose deaths are coded. When a toxicology report returns positive for multiple substances, fentanyl, heroin, and gabapentin, for instance, the medical examiner must select a primary cause of death. The opioid goes in the primary cause field because opioids are the recognized killers, because the coding guidelines point toward them, because the medical examiner has been trained in a system where opioid overdose is the established category, and gabapentin is a background finding. Gabapentin gets listed as a contributing factor if it gets listed at all, buried in a secondary field that most epidemiological databases don't extract, don't aggregate, and don't analyze. The practical consequence was a systematic undercount that persisted for years, silently distorting the national understanding of what was actually killing people. Federal databases tracking overdose mortality showed opioids as the dominant driver, which was accurate, but couldn't show gabapentin's role in making those opioid deaths happen, which was the part that mattered for intervention. Policymakers looking at overdose data saw an opioid crisis. They designed opioid responses. Naloxone distribution expanded. Opioid prescribing restrictions tightened. Medication-assisted treatment programs received funding. All of these were appropriate responses to the opioid data they were seeing. None of them addressed the gabapentin that was turning survivable opioid exposures into fatal ones. The invisibility in the data had a direct policy consequence that can be traced with uncomfortable clarity. States that implemented the most aggressive opioid prescribing restrictions saw gabapentin's presence in overdose deaths increase during the same period. A pattern visible only to researchers specifically looking for it, invisible within the standard reporting frameworks. The policy intervention was creating a substitution effect that the data collection system couldn't capture, which meant the feedback loop that should have triggered a policy adjustment never closed. The response to the crisis was inadvertently deepening one of its dimensions while appearing to address it. The forensic pathologists who first documented the pattern systematically were working at the margins of a system that didn't have infrastructure to support what they were finding. A medical examiner in West Virginia, a state that processed more overdose deaths per capita than almost anywhere in the country, began specifically requesting gabapentin assays on all overdose toxicology in 2013. Most forensic labs at that time ran standard panels that didn't include gabapentin unless it was specifically ordered. Ordering it added cost, added time, and required justification in a system perpetually underfunded and overloaded. What the expanded testing revealed was a number that the medical examiner spent months verifying before publishing, because the number seemed too large to be real. Gabapentin was present in roughly a third of all overdose deaths in the cases where it had been specifically tested for, not as a trace finding, at concentrations consistent with significant intoxication at the time of death. The drug had been present, materially present, in a third of the bodies, and in the cases where standard panels had been run without gabapentin-specific testing, it had gone completely undetected. The implication was immediate and staggering. If a third of overdose deaths in West Virginia involved gabapentin, and West Virginia was representative of other high overdose states, then the national overdose death toll carried a gabapentin signature that had never been measured. Years of mortality data were potentially understating gabapentin's role by an enormous margin. Every policy decision made on the basis of that data had been made with a significant variable simply missing from the equation. Publishing the findings proved harder than collecting them. The first submissions to major epidemiological journals encountered reviewer resistance that reflected the established consensus. Gabapentin was not a significant drug of abuse. The evidence base for its role in overdose deaths was limited. The findings might reflect correlation rather than causation. The same circular logic that had protected gabapentin's reputation for decades operated in the peer review process. The lack of published evidence of harm was itself cited as evidence that the harm was overstated, even as the reason for the lack of published evidence was that no one had been required to collect the data that would show it. Pharmaceutical-affiliated researchers entered the debate with studies specifically designed to contest the emerging findings. These studies applied stringent definitions of gabapentin-caused death that excluded cases where any opioid was also present, which was the majority of cases, given that gabapentin most commonly killed people in combination rather than alone. By defining the category narrowly enough to exclude the mechanism by which gabapentin actually killed people, it was possible to produce research showing gabapentin's mortality contribution was minimal. The studies were published in legitimate journals. They were cited by pharmaceutical companies in regulatory submissions. They shaped the policy conversation. The researchers producing the original findings were not naive about what was happening. They understood that the science had become adversarial, that the normal process of evidence accumulation and consensus formation had been disrupted by the presence of a well-funded interest in a particular outcome. They continued publishing. They collaborated across states, pooling data to produce sample sizes large enough to be undeniable. They presented at conferences where the audience included both skeptical colleagues and pharmaceutical representatives taking notes. The tipping point came not from a single study, but from a convergence of data sources that happened to become available simultaneously in 2017 and 2018. State prescription monitoring programs that had added gabapentin began generating linkable data, prescribing records that could be matched against death records to show who had filled gabapentin prescriptions and later died of overdose. This was different from toxicology evidence. It was administrative evidence, drawn from pharmacy records rather than bodies, and it was harder to contest on methodological grounds. The linked data showed patterns that the toxicology evidence had suggested but couldn't prove definitively. People who had filled gabapentin prescriptions within 30 days of an overdose death were dying at rates significantly higher than people with similar opioid exposure but no gabapentin. The prescription itself, the legitimate physician-written pharmacy-filled prescription, was associated with elevated overdose mortality. The drug that doctors were prescribing as a safer alternative to opioids was, in a measurable and statistically significant proportion of cases, making opioids more deadly. The finding landed in the public health community at a moment when receptivity had been prepared by years of accumulating anecdote, clinical observation, and contested research. It didn't resolve the debate. Nothing in epidemiology resolves a debate quickly when money is at stake. But it shifted the burden of proof. Before, advocates for gabapentin restriction had been required to prove the harm. After, defenders of the status quo were increasingly required to explain the data. That shift, quiet as it was, marked a turning point in how seriously the medical establishment began taking what the numbers had been trying to say for a decade. The bodies had been keeping their own count all along. It had just taken years to learn how to read it. America did not invent the gabapentin problem. It industrialized it. The underlying conditions that turned a prescription anticonvulsant into a public health crisis, aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, inadequate regulatory oversight, undertreated chronic pain, and a medical culture that confused absence of evidence with evidence of absence, existed in every developed country with a functioning pharmaceutical market. What varied was the timeline and the specific shape of the collapse when it came. The United Kingdom arrived at its crisis through a slightly different pharmaceutical route, but ended up in the same place. In Britain, the drug that drove the epidemic most visibly wasn't gabapentin alone, but pregabalin, its chemical successor, marketed under the brand name Lyrica, approved in Europe in 2004. Pregabalin is structurally similar to gabapentin, operates through the same calcium channel mechanism, and produces a comparable but reportedly more reliable euphoric effect at recreational doses. Where gabapentin's oral absorption was inconsistent and unpredictable, pregabalin absorbed more completely and consistently, making the high more controllable and therefore more appealing to recreational users. Pfizer held the patent on Lyrica and priced it accordingly, far above generic gabapentin. But the UK's National Health Service covered it comprehensively, which meant the cost barrier that might have limited access in a private insurance system essentially didn't exist. A British patient could receive pregabalin at virtually no personal cost, and prescriptions for it climbed steeply through the late 2000s and into the 2000s as the same off-label promotion dynamics that had played out in America were replicated in the UK market. By 2015, pregabalin and gabapentin together had become the fastest-growing drug category in NHS prescriptions. The British street market for both drugs had developed its own vocabulary, its own pricing structure, its own supply chains running parallel to the prescription system. Street names circulated in cities where the drugs had been unknown 5 years earlier. A pregabalin capsule selling for pennies at a pharmacy window was worth several pounds on the street outside. The markup reflected not just demand, but the specific value of a drug that combined a genuine high with NHS subsidised availability and, crucially, no legal status as a controlled substance. British harm reduction workers documented the spread with increasing alarm through the mid-2000s. The drug was appearing in overdose deaths alongside heroin and methadone at rates that tracked closely with what American researchers were finding in opioid-affected states. Street outreach workers reported that gabapentin and pregabalin had replaced benzodiazepines as the most commonly encountered non-opioid substances in the populations they served. People in active addiction, people in unstable housing, people cycling through the criminal justice system. The UK government's Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs recommended scheduling both gabapentin and pregabalin in 2016. The government accepted the recommendation, and both drugs became Class C controlled substances in April 2019. The gap between the recommendation and implementation, 3 years, was attributed to the complexity of the legislative process. During those 3 years, prescriptions continued at elevated rates, and deaths continued to accumulate. The post-scheduling data from the UK produced findings that neither advocates nor opponents of scheduling had fully predicted. Prescriptions for both drugs fell sharply, by roughly 30% in the 2 years following scheduling. Diversion into street markets decreased measurably in areas with robust monitoring. The supply that had been flowing through legitimate prescriptions into illicit channels was genuinely disrupted. These were real gains, and they happened faster than many had expected. But a countervailing pattern emerged simultaneously. The street price of both drugs rose as prescription-based supply contracted. Higher prices incentivized importation. Gabapentin and pregabalin, manufactured in countries with minimal pharmaceutical regulation, began appearing in UK drug markets, obtained through online pharmacies operating in legal grey zones, shipped through postal systems that couldn't screen every parcel. The composition of these imported products was inconsistent. Some were genuine pharmaceutical-grade gabapentin. Others were underdosed, adulterated, or counterfeit. Users who had previously known exactly what they were taking now faced uncertainty that added its own layer of risk. The scheduling had done what scheduling does. It had moved the problem rather than eliminated it, trading one set of risks for a different configuration of risks. The lesson wasn't that scheduling was wrong. It was that scheduling alone, without parallel investment in treatment infrastructure, harm reduction services, and supply monitoring, was insufficient to resolve a crisis that had been building for 20 years. Australia's encounter with gabapentin misuse followed a timeline approximately 5 years behind the United States, compressed into a shorter period because Australian health authorities had the American and British experience as a warning they could theoretically learn from. The warning was only partially heeded. Gabapentin was rescheduled from Schedule 4 to Schedule 4 with additional monitoring requirements in some states, then became a subject of national regulatory debate as misuse data accumulated through the late 2000s. The Australian pattern had a feature that made it distinctive. The country's geographic concentration meant that misuse patterns were highly visible in specific urban and regional clusters rather than distributed evenly across a large territory. Emergency departments in certain Sydney and Melbourne neighbourhoods began reporting gabapentin as a consistent co-intoxicant in overdose presentations. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in remote areas, already facing disproportionate health disadvantages and limited access to addiction treatment, were identified as experiencing particularly acute gabapentin misuse patterns, a finding that pointed directly at the connection between undertreated chronic pain, limited healthcare access, and pharmaceutical misuse that the American Appalachian crisis had already demonstrated. The Middle East and Eastern Europe represented the furthest frontier of the gabapentin problem, the places where pharmaceutical market development had outpaced regulatory infrastructure most dramatically. In several countries across the Middle East, gabapentin was available without prescription from pharmacies that operated with minimal government oversight. The combination of over-the-counter availability, low cost, and the absence of alcohol as a legal intoxicant in some jurisdictions made gabapentin an attractive substitute in populations seeking legal or semi-legal means of intoxication. Reports from harm reduction organizations operating in Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt documented gabapentin misuse in urban populations through the mid-2000s. The drug appeared in communities with high rates of untreated anxiety and depression, in refugee populations with concentrated trauma histories, in young men with limited economic prospects and high psychological distress. The pattern was consistent with what had appeared everywhere else, gabapentin filling the space created by unmet mental health need, but the regulatory and treatment infrastructure to respond was significantly thinner than in Western countries. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Georgia and Ukraine, gabapentin occupied a specific niche in drug markets, where opioid substitution therapies were underfunded, stigmatized, and geographically inaccessible. People who couldn't access methadone or buprenorphine treatment used gabapentin to manage opioid withdrawal symptoms and cravings, a harm reduction strategy that was self-directed, medically unsupervised, and spreading through word of mouth in communities where the formal health system had essentially abandoned the people who most needed it. The international picture, assembled from these disparate sources, revealed something that individual country-level analyses had obscured. Gabapentin misuse was not an American anomaly, not a British peculiarity, not a regional artifact of specific economic or social conditions. It was a global response to a global set of conditions, the intersection of undertreated pain, undertreated mental illness, inadequate addiction treatment, aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, and regulatory systems that had been built for a different era and a different list of threats. Every country that had gabapentin available had significant populations in chronic pain or psychological distress, and had inadequate treatment alternatives had produced some version of the same problem. The specific shape varied, the underlying driver was consistent, and the regulatory responses, when they came, were consistently slower than the crisis they were responding to, measured in years of lag time during which the harm continued and the evidence accumulated and the bodies were counted. The global spread of gabapentin misuse was, in the most uncomfortable sense, a feature rather than a bug of the international pharmaceutical system. A drug developed with genuine therapeutic intent had been marketed without adequate safety assessment, prescribed without adequate monitoring, and distributed at scale into a world that was carrying more pain than it had infrastructure to treat. The molecule had found that pain wherever it existed. The system had provided the delivery mechanism, and the consequences were still unfolding in countries whose governments hadn't yet acknowledged that the problem had arrived. The tools to address the gabapentin crisis exist. They existed in most cases before the crisis reached its current scale. Prescription drug monitoring programs, when implemented comprehensively and actually used by prescribers, demonstrably reduce the overprescribing patterns that feed both misuse and diversion. Tapering protocols, when followed, prevent the withdrawal crises that drive people back to drug use. Harm reduction education, when it reaches the populations most at risk, saves lives in the gap between where people are and where the treatment system can reach them. The problem is not a shortage of tools. It is a shortage of will, coordination, and honesty about what those tools actually require to function. Prescription drug monitoring programs carry a fundamental weakness that their advocates rarely lead with. They are only as effective as the clinicians who use them. In states where PDMP checks are mandatory before prescribing gabapentin, compliance rates in the first years after implementation hovered around 60 to 70%, meaning that roughly a third of prescriptions were still being written without the prescriber checking whether the patient had obtained the same drug from 3 other physicians the previous week. Mandatory doesn't mean enforced. The monitoring infrastructure existed. The culture of actually using it was built slowly, unevenly, and incompletely. The naloxone distribution programs that had been expanded significantly in response to the opioid crisis created a specific problem when applied to gabapentin-involved overdoses that most distribution programs hadn't addressed. Naloxone reverses opioid receptor binding. Gabapentin doesn't work through opioid receptors. A bystander who administers naloxone to someone who has overdosed on gabapentin alone will see no response, not because the naloxone failed, but because it was the right tool for the wrong drug. In polydrug overdoses involving both opioids and gabapentin, naloxone addresses the opioid component, while the gabapentin component continues suppressing respiration. Harm reduction organizations that distributed naloxone kits began adding gabapentin-specific education to their outreach materials in the mid-2000s, but the integration was inconsistent and the messaging was complicated. Telling someone that their naloxone might not work, or might only partially work without simultaneously providing an alternative, was a message that required careful calibration. The alternative, calling emergency services immediately rather than relying solely on naloxone, was the correct guidance, but it ran against the street reality of populations who had deep, historically grounded reasons to avoid police contact. The treatment infrastructure that existed for opioid addiction was not designed for gabapentin dependence, and adapting it required more than adding a new substance to an existing checklist. Gabapentin withdrawal management needed its own protocols, slow tapers over weeks or months depending on duration of use and dose, monitoring for seizure risk, management of the psychiatric symptoms that complicated the process. Most detoxification facilities had no standardized gabapentin taper protocol as recently as 2020. Staff training on gabapentin-specific withdrawal was virtually non-existent in programs that had been built around opioid, alcohol, and benzodiazepine treatment. The financing of addiction treatment compounded the clinical inadequacy. Insurance reimbursement for detoxification and residential treatment was calibrated around opioid and alcohol withdrawal timelines, typically days to a week for medical stabilization. Gabapentin withdrawal, properly managed, required far longer tapers that didn't fit standard reimbursement categories. Treatment providers who attempted to do the work correctly found themselves fighting insurance companies for coverage of extended tapering periods that the clinical evidence supported but the billing codes didn't accommodate. Patients who couldn't access properly funded treatment were discharged prematurely, experienced protracted withdrawal, and frequently returned to drug use within weeks. The research gap that had allowed gabapentin's risks to remain invisible for decades was finally beginning to close, but the pace of scientific progress bore no relationship to the pace of clinical need. Basic questions about gabapentin dependence, why some patients developed it after short exposures while others took the drug for years without significant withdrawal, what genetic or neurological factors predicted vulnerability, what the optimal taper rate was for different patient profiles, remained unanswered or partially answered as of the mid-2000s. The funding landscape for this research was paradoxical. Pharmaceutical companies had no financial incentive to fund research that would establish their product as dependence-forming. Such findings would reduce prescribing, invite regulation, and potentially create legal liability. Federal research funding through the NIH was available, but competed against every other research priority simultaneously, and gabapentin, despite its scale of impact, was not receiving research investment proportionate to the number of people it was affecting. Academic researchers working on gabapentin dependence operated with smaller grants, shorter timelines, and less institutional support than the scale of the problem warranted. The studies that did emerge were beginning to point toward individual vulnerability factors, variations in calcium channel subunit genetics that might predict who would develop dependence, trauma history correlations, concurrent psychiatric diagnosis patterns. This research was genuinely promising. It suggested that the binary framing of gabapentin as either safe or dangerous was inadequate. The drug existed on a risk spectrum that varied enormously across individuals, and the clinical future lay in identifying who was on which part of that spectrum before prescribing rather than discovering it after the harm had occurred. The patients who had experienced gabapentin dependence and emerged from it through managed tapers, through sheer determination, through treatment programs that happened to be equipped to help them, became an unexpected force in shaping the public conversation. Online communities that had originally formed around harm reduction and shared experience evolved into advocacy platforms. patients with documented histories of gabapentin withdrawal compiled their experiences and submitted them to FDA docket processes during label revision periods. Some testified before state legislative committees. Some collaborated directly with researchers, providing detailed clinical histories that filled gaps in formally collected data. This patient advocacy had an impact that was disproportionate to its resources precisely because the patient's accounts were so clinically specific and so difficult to dismiss. These weren't vague complaints about a medication that hadn't worked. They were detailed, medically coherent descriptions of a recognizable syndrome, corroborated by enough independent sources across enough geographic and demographic contexts to constitute an evidentiary record in its own right. When the FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System, FAERS, was analysed specifically for gabapentin discontinuation symptoms, thousands of reports consistent with withdrawal syndrome were found, submitted over years by patients whose physicians had told them the drug couldn't cause what they were experiencing. The physicians who'd been prescribing gabapentin in good faith for decades faced a professional reckoning that was uncomfortable and necessary simultaneously. The information they had acted on had been shaped by pharmaceutical marketing. The trials they had trusted had been designed inadequately. The clinical culture they had trained within had normalized prescribing practices that the emerging evidence now challenged. None of this made them individually culpable in a straightforward sense. They had operated within a system, using the information that system had provided in ways the system had encouraged. But the reckoning required something more than absolution. It required a genuine revision of prescribing practice, not the defensive minimization that sometimes follows medical error, but an honest recalibration of when gabapentin is appropriate, at what doses, for how long, with what monitoring, and with what plan for discontinuation built in from the beginning, rather than added as an afterthought when a problem developed. Some physicians made this revision readily, incorporating new evidence into their practice with the same fluency they brought to updating their understanding of any other clinical area. Others resisted, not out of dishonesty, but out of the cognitive difficulty of revising beliefs that had been held confidently for a long time, and that continued to feel supported by their own clinical experience. The cycle that gabapentin had traced, development with genuine therapeutic intent, aggressive commercial promotion beyond the evidence base, broad adoption based on manufactured consensus, gradual accumulation of harm, slow regulatory response, belated clinical reckoning, was not a cycle that gabapentin had invented. It was the cycle that benzodiazepines had traced before it, the cycle that opioids had traced, the cycle that, by 2025, was beginning to appear in preliminary form around several newer pharmaceutical classes whose long-term risk profiles remained incompletely characterized. The lesson of gabapentin was not that the drug shouldn't exist. Millions of people genuinely needed it and were genuinely helped by it. The lesson was structural, a pharmaceutical approval system that tested drugs on short timelines in selected populations, combined with a marketing system that could expand use far beyond approved indications before evidence of harm could accumulate, combined with a regulatory response system that moved on a timeline measured in years, while harm accumulated on a timeline measured in months. This combination would produce the gabapentin outcome with any sufficiently effective and broadly applicable drug. The molecule was interchangeable. The system was the constant. Somewhere in America tonight, a physician is writing a gabapentin prescription for a patient in genuine pain, using clinical judgment informed by imperfect evidence, trying to help. Somewhere else, someone is crushing the same pill on the back of a toilet tank in a gas station bathroom, chasing relief that the system was never adequately designed to provide in any other form. Both of them are products of the same failure, a failure not of individual moral character, but of collective institutional design, playing out across decades, accumulating consequences that the people who built the system will never be required to account for, and that the people inside it will continue bearing long after this story ends.